Hello and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll continue our discussion on the 1944 film, The Negro Soldier. Produced at the behest of the War Department, The Negro Soldier is a call to arms for African Americans across the country. It is a prideful piece that shows the accomplishments of African Americans not only in the military, but also in science, society, and the arts, and made at a time in American history when African Americans were certainly not treated as equals, which is one reason why the film is still important to this day. Told through narration, the film doesn't really star anyone, but does feature the likes of Jesse Owens, Benjamin Davis, George Washington Carver, and Carlton Moss. The film is directed by Stuart Heisler, produced by the great Frank Capra, and distributed by the War Activities Committee. It received wide praise upon release and has since been deemed, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, unquote, by the United States Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the National Film Registry.
You're in the Marine Corps, and he slapped this big brown envelope in my chest as he was telling me, you're in the Marine Corps. So, okay, I stood there. What do I do now? You know, it didn't mean anything to me. I'd never heard of the Marines. So he yelled again, you're in the Marine Corps. What am I supposed to do with that, you know? So he half got up and kind of pushed me back. And I guess he's done with me. So I went home, and when I got home, I opened the envelope, and there was a material there about how to get from San Francisco to Camp Lejeune, things like that. So I said, okay. I take the train from San Francisco to Chicago, from Chicago to Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. to North Carolina, and then, well, the first two parts of that were fine. When I got to Washington, D.C., as I've told you, the trains were crowded, and they only had one coach for Negroes, and that coach filled up very quickly. Although there was space on the other coaches, you would think they would have said, for military or draftees, we're not going to try to abide those rules. So, by the time I got to the train, it had started to move. I panicked and I went and I looked and I saw this SP, and I said, I've been drafted by the Marines, and the train's moving, that he won't let me on. He said, boy, you're a damn liar. There are none of you people in the Marines. He hit my orders, and he slapped it out of my hand. Oh my God, the train moving, my orders on the ground. I picked it up and gave it back to him, slapped it on the ground. That happened a couple of times. Finally, he opened it. He said, well, I'll be damned. They are letting you people in the Marines. Well, I'll be damned. Okay. He stopped the train. By that time, the one coach for African Americans was way up near the coal car, so by the time the train stopped, I had to walk quite a distance. I had to go all the way up to the Negro coach.
That was the voice of Edgar Cole. Cole was a former Marine, one who was drafted, which for the Marines in World War II was a rarity. On top of that, he was an African-American draftee of the Marine Corps, which makes his situation even more rare. Cole completed boot camp in late 1944, and because of the timing, he never deployed overseas. Edgar's experience as he boarded the train to boot camp was unfortunately not an uncommon experience. Racism in 1940s America was as common as grass, and racism in the military was a reflection of American society at the time. The Army, the Navy, and the Marines, they were all a Jim Crow Army, Jim Crow service branches. As early as 1940, the War Department, an official government agency, mind you, stated as a matter of policy, and I quote, not to intermingle colored and white personnel in the same regimental organizations, end quote. A great many U.S. Army training posts were located in the American South, And as it was the Army policy to adhere to local customs and traditions, that meant that the Southern Jim Crow laws and rules applied to African Americans on that specific United States Army base as well. That meant that an African American soldier who was from, say, Cleveland, would have to ponder questions such as, would he be served if he went to the base PX? Which base theater, base bus stop, or which base barber could he use, if any? Was he able to enter the base Red Cross? What about the gym? Would the base clothing cleaning service launder his clothes if needed? Would he be well received in the nearby town? Answers to these questions varied from base to base, but the general answer, especially to the question of whether or not he would be served outside the base, was generally a big fat no. African American troops were barred from most base facilities, lived in segregated barracks, and even African American MPs, that being, of course, military police, were barred from carrying sidearms. It was truly disgraceful. In some cases, prisoners of war were treated better than African American servicemen. German POWs, all of whom, who were white, were allowed to eat in the common mess hall, whereas African American troops could not. African American writer Whitner Bryant wrote a poem entitled Defeat, and I'll read a bit of it to you now. It goes like this. On a train in Texas, German prisoners eat, with white American soldiers seat by seat. While black American soldiers sit apart, the white men eating meat, the black men heart. Now with that other war a century done, not the live North, but the dead South has won. Nor yet a riven nation comes awake. Whom are we fighting this time, for God's sake? Mark well the token of the separate seat. It is again ourselves whom we defeat. The Army was certainly not the only segregated service branch. As I mentioned earlier on this and the main episode, the United States Navy was arguably the hardest service branch on African Americans. While by nature, African Americans did in fact cohabitate with white sailors, being on a ship and all, they were still more often than not completely separate from one another. African Americans who were in the Navy were usually made mess attendants and service troops. And while most took that slap in the face as simply status quo, there were a great many who took it as a great offense, as they should. One of those sailors who did that very thing was a man named Harold Ward. Harold was a pre-war sailor who joined the Navy out of Atlantic City to get a new pair of shoes, a roof over his head, and a way out of the life he was currently in. Upon completion of boot camp, Harold was assigned to the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco. He was aboard the ship during the Pearl Harbor attack and would later see heavy action at Guadalcanal. For now, let's listen to Harold's opinion and experiences of serving in the Jim Crow Navy.
Had I gone to work for the railroad and I didn't like being a porter, I could have said the hell with it and walked away. But once you put your hand in the air, and I was trained, you're going to be a man, you keep your word. Stuck for 6 years. Fight for my country, shining shoes. That was bitchly to me. I stayed angry through the entire war. I did. I subdued it somewhat as time went on, because otherwise I'd have wound up in nut house. But those early days, before the war started, and after the war was brand new, it was recognized I wasn't a good servant. Early on, I always remember the humorous thing. I had what they call the pantry watch in the wardroom. We're all steaming around out there in Guadalcanal area in that campaign, and they all come down to relieve the watch, these officers. And here you are with this damn tray, and it's got sugar and cream in the coffee pot, blah, blah, blah. And this damn JG says, "Hold it, got that tray still, goddammit!" The look I gave him must have been murderous, because the executive officer put me on report. And when I went to exec's mast, because I didn't know I was on report until the master at arms came for me. He says, "You got a 10 o'clock with the exec's mast." I said, "Oh, for crying out loud." So the exec told me, he says, "I put you on report." Why, you don't ask why, you just keep your mouth shut and stay at attention. I don't like your attitude. I wound up captain to the head. Best goddamn job I had on the ship. I didn't shine anybody's shoes but mine. I cleaned the heads and the showers and our living spaces. The only time they ever saw me in the wardroom country was when I came up there to eat, and then I disappeared again.
An irony to all of this is that, in the Navy at least, while African Americans were forced to serve as service troops and mess attendants, while at battle stations, the story was different. Their duties at battle stations were no different than those of whites: ammunition handlers, corpsmen, stretcher bearers, and the like. When the chips were down and all hell broke loose, more often than not, the Navy didn't seem to care what color you actually were. And while I could bemoan the racism of the military in World War II for another hour or more, I won't. I feel that you, dear listener, have gotten the point. As such, I would like to end on a high note, and in closing, I will leave y'all with a clip from the legendary Roscoe Brown, a pilot in the 332nd Fighter Group. Here he talks about the legacy of arguably the most famous of all African American units in World War II history.
So we got the word the night before that we were going to be escorting these B-17s, because the B-24s couldn't go that far, to Berlin. And as we got over the outskirts of Berlin, I first saw these streaks, which I knew were jets from where I had seen them when we were on the photo-constant movement, and they were coming up to attack the bombers. I'm over the bombers. I immediately said, drop your tanks and follow me. And I did a reverse peel, up, down, what they call upside, modified split S, down under the bombers, going away from the jet so he didn't see me. And then I turned into his blind spot, put on my electronic gun sight, and boom, there he was. And that was the first jet that was shot down over Berlin. And I looked down at my fuel gauge. My fuel gauge was below half. So I just took off, and I flew about 700 miles back by myself, because there were no German fighters around, to land at our alternative base, which was Rimini in northern Italy. And there I landed, and the engine turned off. They reached there, you don't have any more gas. So if I had stayed there another 3 or 4 minutes, I probably wouldn't have made it back. So then I filled up with some more gas and flew back to Ramitelli, and that's where we did the victory roll. Come down the deck, bring it up, turn it up, go across the wings, bring it up, turn it up. They knew what we had done. That was the greatest day in the history of the Tuskegee Airmen, March 24th, 1945, and we did receive the Distinguished Unit Citation. We got this as the Tuskegee Airmen, the Presidential Unit Citation, and General came to later on to give us the citation, say how proud we were. We Stars and Stripes, we got it. The black press, jets over Berlin, shoot down jets. That was really the high point of the Tuskegee Airmen. So we are known as jet killers, and we are known as the Red Tail Angels, and that is our tradition.
And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next week when we discuss the 1977 film Cross of Iron. Until then, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Mallory Kirk, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.